Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, a very warm welcome to City Legal in Phillip Street, Sydney. We are almost full in the Law Society. Next time, we're going to have to put in more seats, more tables, because if you're watching online, there's a really lot of people here today. Today, we're starting a new mini-series on what is humanity and does it have a future? My name is Mark Streeter, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you this morning to the City Legal event. And we are an organisational community that exists to consider the bigger questions of life with suits and city workers in cities around Australia by looking at the Bible together. And if you're new to City Legal, it's a very special welcome to you. The format is a brief talk followed by the opportunity to ask some questions. We aim to finish very tight on 8:20, if not before. One of the features of this presentation is the opportunity to ask questions. So while our speaker, David Robertson, will be engaging and provoking our thinking, that may also stimulate some thoughts on your part, and you have the opportunity to ask questions. If you're online, you can ask questions by the chat function or by using the Slido link that is on the chat on the Zoom. But if you're in person here, on the back of the handouts on the tables, there's an opportunity just to write a question, and there'll be a roving mic that you'll be able to ask that question yourself. So we will repeat the question for those online up here so that they'll be able to hear it. Slido also provides the opportunity for you to vote. So if you like a particular question that's been asked, you can put it up the list of, by putting a more vote on it. Now, I'm just going to ask David a couple of questions by way of introduction. David, welcome. Humanity's big question. What intrigues you about this author that might be useful?
And lots of people, maybe I'm being able to so on, but he's hugely influential. So Elon Musk and Bill Gates and, you know, others of your superheroes are very keen on this guy. So I'm intrigued at why he's so popular. That's why I got his book to read it, and I've read 2 of his books.
Okay, so you know, I was thinking I needed 3 coffees to be able to handle the topic this morning. So are we going to get overwhelmed with a bit of philosophical discourse?
Well, I mean, I'm assuming most of you here are lawyers, and therefore I'm assuming this may not necessarily work, but I'm assuming that you're intelligent. I'm assuming that most of you are awake in the morning, and if you've not, you've had coffee to get you awake. Actually, this is probably the best time. Afternoons are dreadful. You know, I mean, personally, I think major court cases should be held at 7 in the morning, because that's when you get the sharpest minds. But that may not be true for everyone here, but I'm a farm boy, so I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, so this is mid-morning for me, so you'll cope.
Thanks so much. David's just asked us to read a passage from the Bible, from Psalm 8. If you're online, the text of that passage will be showing up on the screen, and if you're in the room, it's printed on the inside of the handout that's on the table in front of you. So Psalm 8, NIV 2011 translation. Lord our God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory in the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You have made them rulers over the works of your hands. You have put everything under their feet, all the flocks and the herds and the animals of the wild, and the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, all that swim in the paths of the seas. Lord our God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Thanks, Dave.
What are human rights? You're a lawyer and you've got to do human rights. How do you define what human rights are if you can't define what a human being is? I've heard a lawyer argue that dolphins have human rights. I saw, and I didn't quite believe it, but I kind of eventually got there to understand that lakes have human rights. So the term human rights becomes kind of strange. You've got to be able to say, what is a human being? And that's like one of those things that if somebody says, what is time? Well, we all know what time is. Yeah, but do we? And in terms of what humanity is, that's hugely important. So Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, I think it's been translated into 50 languages. It is very, very influential in a lot of circles. And it was written to understand this most basic of questions. What is a human being? Are we anything more than a blob of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another? We live, as Carl Sagan says, on this pale blue dot in the midst of a vast universe. Who are we? And you may think, okay, well, how does that connect with today's society? Well, I have watched over this past week numerous politicians in the United Kingdom refuse to answer or be unable to answer the question, what is a woman? Believe you me, that has enormous implications for women's rights. If you can't say what a woman is, but they won't. Oh, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Well, we're going to go down that rabbit hole and ask not what is a woman, but what is a human being. I thought before I turn to the passage that we read, I would just summarize what Sapiens actually says. It's entitled A Brief History of Humankind, going from the Stone Age up to the 21st century. He divides it into 4 revolutions: the cognitive revolution from 70,000 BC, to the agricultural revolution from around 10,000 BC, the development of agriculture, obviously, the unification of humankind from around 34 AD. I still use the old terminology. The scientific revolution from about 1543, which there are interesting categories in which he puts them. Now, one of the problems that Harari has is simply this. I remember we had a particular kind of creationist come to speak at my church, and I remember speaking to a biologist afterwards, and I said, how did you cope with that guy? Where were you at? And he said, well, I don't know about the geology or the chemistry or the physics, but I'm a biologist, and in my field, he was way out of line. And Harari's like that. He writes about history, he writes about archaeology, he writes about science. And if that happens to be your speciality, you say, oh, wait a minute, he just got this wrong. But because he speaks so assertively, and he's quite an inspirational writer, people sort of very much buy into it. It's also just an incredibly depressing book. I mean, I read it, and he just made Leonard Cohen look cheerful. It was just, oh my goodness. I'm from a Scottish Presbyterian background, and in our Highlands, we're all dressed in black and everything. And he just made us look like raving charismatics. He's so depressing. And I did. And the second book, I thought, do I have to read this? And I did have to read it. And but he argues that there's a lack of research into the history of happiness, and says that people today are not significantly happier than in past eras. Well, I could have told him that. And he then goes on to talk about how modern technology may end the species as we know it, genetic engineering, and so on. He argues that human beings have become God, which for those of you who are Christians, you can understand that's always been the temptation. You shall be as gods. Let me just give you one quote. The animal that became a god. We have mastered our surroundings, increased food production, built cities, established empires, and created far-flung trade networks. But did we decrease the amount of suffering in the world? Time and again, massive increases in human power did not necessarily improve the well-being of individual sapiens, and usually created immediate misery to other animals. In the last few decades, I love this. These books get dated very quickly. So I think this was written in 2012. I'm not exactly sure of the date. But in the last few decades, he said, we have at least made some real progress as far as the human condition is concerned with the reduction of famine, plague, and war. So I mean, yeah, okay, that's worked out well. Yet the situation of other animals is deteriorating more rapidly than ever before, and the improvement in the lot of humanity is too recent and fragile to be certain of. And I think one of the huge problems, I mean, I do think he's onto something in trying to define a human being and thinking about more than just economics. But he just doesn't really get anywhere. Now, when we turn to Psalm 8, verse 4 says, "What is mankind that you're mindful of them, human beings that you care for them?" What is man is a title of an essay by Martin Luther King published in 1959, in which he argues that humanity is more than an animal and less than God. Now, I would always argue the more than an animal. People, what do you mean by that? Well, when I've seen this many times, as I say, I grew up on a farm. When a pig, a female sow, eats her own young, we don't take her to court. When a seal, you know those nice cuddly Disney-esque seals? Well, I grew up beside the seal, and what a seal would do, sometimes just for fun, they'd take one bite out of a salmon and leave it to die in agony. We don't prosecute the seal for cruelty. You can't really. So there's been a fire up in Newtown where someone said it and killed at least 3 people. If an animal, if a dog went and knocked over a candle or something, you don't prosecute the dog. But generally you do human beings. So what is the difference? We're less than God. Harari's problem is he tries to make humanity as God. He says there's almost nothing above humanity. But the Martin Luther King's thing of human beings are more than an animal and less than God is the basic understanding of humanity, which has prevailed in Europe and the West for most of the past 2,000 years. Ironically, that definition of humanity is being destroyed by secular humanists. So I once had an argument with the president of the Secular Humanist Society, and he got really upset because I said to him that he wasn't really humanist enough, and that the Humanist Society was anti-human. And I would maintain that, actually. I would hold to that. And it was an interesting discussion that followed from there on. Now, part of this is tied in with G.K. Chesterton saying that when you cease to believe in God, it's not that you believe in nothing, it's that you believe in anything. And not only do you lose God, but you lose humanity. And I do think, I speak to a lot of young people who are completely confused. Scotland, a 7-year-old girl came home from school and said to her parents, she was crying, she was upset. Her parents said, "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" She said, "Mum, am I a boy or a girl? Because the teacher says I can choose." I'm like, okay, you're a human being. Can you choose to be anything that you want to be? We may laugh at this and think it's ridiculous, but there's a lot of things that are ridiculous that become accepted. So I met somebody who seriously argued that they thought that they would become a cat, and they probably were a cat, and they were a cat born in a human body. Well, what do you do with that? If biology is redundant, then why not? And that's part of the confusion that exists amongst so many people. Once you lose the sense of the divine, I would argue you also lose the sense of the human. That's why, for me, the example in humanitarianism or humanism is to enable people to know God. In fact, without the divine, we are missing an essential part of what it is to be human. Now, I am, although I work for Sydney Anglicans, I am a Scottish Presbyterian, and every now and then I return to my roots, and we have a thing called the Catechism. The Catholics have a catechism as well. So the Catholics and the Calvinists, we're together on that one. Ours is just better. But no, wait. And we have this thing, and it says, "How did God create man?" Question 10. And if you've been brought up in that tradition, you'd be able to answer straight away. God created man, male and female, after his own image, in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, with dominion over the creatures. An essential part of being human, that we are male and female. Male and female are equal in the Christian thing, in terms of, let's say, biology or whatever. That's one of the problems with having men who identify as women participating in some women's sports. You know, that doesn't make any sense. But male and women are equal because we are both made in the image of God, which is why the notion always of, if anyone tries to draw a picture of God, you know, the famous one of an old man in the sky pointing his finger, that's just utterly ludicrous. So, but an essential part of humanity is gender, and the destruction of gender is way, way beyond. Now, I'm not talking here about transgender. For 30 years, I've been working with people who are transgender, and I recognize that there is a condition called gender identity disorder. And there are lots of struggles that people have. Nor am I talking about gender stereotypes. You know, real men don't eat quiche. And one time I went to this sounds really strange, but I was hitchhiking around France and we had no food. We ran out of food. We ran out of money, me and my mate. And I remembered I had a French pen pal. So I'd only written to her once, but never mind, that was enough. I had her address. So I phoned her up. And she said, "Oh, David, my dad will come and collect you." Well, we landed royalty because she stayed in a castle, literally, a chateau. And we went and we had this after having nothing eaten for a day, we had this most incredible meal, like 6-course French thing that went on for 4 hours, loads of wine, and it's just dreamy. And at the end of it, I got up and the man said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to go and do the dishes because that's the least I can do." And he went, No. Men don't do dishes. I have daughters, I have a wife, I have a mother, let them do it. You know, I said, "Oh, okay, that's not exactly." So I'm not talking about those kind of gender stereotypes, but I'm talking about the fundamentals, basically, of biology, how we express gender. That may be something different. Being human ties in with gender, being human ties in with identity. If we are made in the image of God, that is our primary identity. Different times in society, we have different identities that are privileged. And you say, well, that's not the case. No, everyone's equal. That's absolute nonsense. When you make identity whatever you feel it to be, the people who are in power will empower the identities they think to be the most privileged. So I read a piece in the newspaper coming in today that in terms of there's going to be a hospital or a health center set up for one particular identity. And I'm just thinking, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? When did we start making identity that important? And what do we mean by identity? Who are we? Marriage created male and female. I would argue that the Christian understanding of marriage, also the Jewish, the Islamic, is fundamental to the good of society. Children are best brought up within that context. There are, of course, many exceptions, many things that are wrong, and so on. But that whole idea of marriage is fundamental. And society as well. We are made communal beings. Harari argues that we are the only animal that groups together in that way. I don't agree with that, but I think he has a point to some degree. Now, one of the key issues here is, well, if that's true, what's gone wrong? Because when we look at the world, there's this very optimistic and I think delusional view of humanity, which basically says human beings are born good and there's a few people who screw things up. So Steven Pinker and others argue along the lines of there are some people who are, most people are good. There are some people who are evil. Good people do good things. Evil people do evil things. But for good people to do evil things, it takes religion. And what happens is that they make humanity as kind of, we're all essentially good. Now, the Bible argues something both stronger and opposite. So the stronger aspect of it is human beings are not just chemicals. We are made in the image of God. That does give us a dignity. That all human beings, that's where we look and we say, even if you're, I don't know, an invader of Ukraine, we always get new groups to hate in our society. So, if you're a Russian, I mean, I'm still stunned at this. These are meant to be intelligent people. If you want to know what the decline of Western society is, just think of the fact that it's the University of Milan have banned Dostoevsky because he's Russian, not knowing that Dostoevsky was imprisoned by the Tsar for criticizing the Russian leadership. I mean, even to think like that. But humanity, we're in this society, there's just something fundamentally flawed within humanity. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, as the Bible said. We are incredible. We're all made in God's image, and yet something has gone wrong. And in the Bible, that's referred to what we refer to as the fall. And that's something that affects the environment. So it is true that we've always affected the environment. That's something that affects society. There have always been wars. You can't name a period when there haven't been wars. And it's something that affects our relationships with others, because there isn't a single one of you here that doesn't have relationship problems at times. And if you tell me that you do, I want to meet your partner or your friends, or you probably don't have a partner or any friends, so you have no relationship worries because you have no relationships. But for those of us who do have relationships, it can be a real problem. I would argue that before the fall, humanity lived to do the will of God. After the fall, we are autonomous and we seek to be God. And that is the problem. We think we are in control of everything. I'm so fascinated by, here's an observation for you. I wonder what you think of this. I think our society, with all its technology and so on, can't cope with more than one disaster at a time. So amazingly, whatever else you think about Putin, you have to give him thanks that COVID has now disappeared. Or, you look at things and you say, well, we had the rains and everything, and Ukraine didn't disappear, but it certainly was off the front pages and everyone was thinking about the rains and the floods. But what got me about the rains and the floods was the number of people who I saw on social media, and I shouldn't take my stuff from social media, I know, but the number of people who said, it's not fair. There's floods and there shouldn't be floods and someone's responsible. And it's ScoMo or whatever. Now, without getting into the politics of that, the idea that somehow the Prime Minister of Australia is responsible for floods is to give him an extraordinary power that he just doesn't have. But people have this idea, things shouldn't be like this, and someone must be to blame. Well, I would argue that humanity's biggest problem is that we seek to be autonomous, we seek to go our own way, we seek to be as God. That is the root of all our problems. That was the promise of the devil. You believe that you do this and you shall be like God. Autonomy is what our society demands and celebrates, and autonomy is what our society cannot cope with. I hope this isn't true here, but in the United Kingdom, up until very recently, the #1 song played at crematoriums was, "And now the end is near." I'll not sing it for you. "And so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear. I'll state my case of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway. But more, much more than this, I did it my way." Sung by a man who, let's put it that way, he's extremely questionable connections. I did it my way. Well, what's that, the Burger King advert? Have it your way. Sometimes the greatest punishment God can ever give us is say, okay, you have it your way. Let's see how you deal with it. And we don't deal with it very well. So I would argue that humanity is made in the image of God. I would argue that sin is rebellion against God, an assertion of our own sovereignty and authority. I would argue that those of us who are Christians could never say, it's my body and I'll do with it what I want. Really? So this is my body, reminding me at this time in the morning. But if I walked down onto Martin Place and stripped naked, it's my body, I'll do what I want. That's a horrendous image. No, you can't do that. I think that the Christian worldview, I would say the secular humanist worldviews, takes what people would like to be true today, and they interpret the past through that limited and fanciful view. I would say the Christian worldview interprets the present through the eyes of the past. And when we come on to look at Harari's second book, where he discusses the future of humanity, all these things like transhumanism and so on, I think it's important to bear this in mind. So just the summary I would say is simply say is this: every single human being is a remarkable creation, made in the image of God, but flawed. And we have to work on that. It's from that basis that everything, the equality, the inclusion, and the diversity that are so valued as buzzwords in our society, but almost have become to mean the opposite. It's on that basis that we can actually have these things. And that's how we get human rights. Okay, we'll leave it there. Mark.
Okay, well, David, you may stay up here and I'll do the roving mic. We have an opportunity to ask questions. If you're online, you could text to the number that's on the screen, or you could use the Slido function. But if you're in this room, just raise your hand and I'll come around with the roving mic and you can ask your question directly to the speaker. It always works that way because my writing's usually pretty bad and I can't even read good writing. So that's helpful. If someone can read it, okay, I see a hand. So David, we go.
Let's go.
Oh, I was just waving.
That's one of the dangers of having a hand up.
It's like being at an auction, isn't it? No, you've just paid $50,000 for a painting, and you were just scratching your nose. You know, go for it.
Was a senior counsel there putting you in it then?
Look, I was taken by surprise just then, but I was particularly interested in what you said about gender dysphoria, and I do practice in that area.
Yeah.
Given what you said, what are your views about it's said that a person with gender dysphoria is at an increased risk of suicide because they're not necessarily accepted by society. What are your views on that?
I think the evidence for that is entirely minimal, and it's used as an emotional argument to browbeat people in terms of. So let me just give you one example. I've been involved in this area. I remember one doctor contacting me and said, "Look, David, basically what you're saying is right, although I disagree with you on a couple of things." He wasn't a Christian, and I said, "What's your expertise in this area?" He said, "That I do gender transition operations," or he said, "I did." And I said, "What do you mean you did?" He said, "Well, they have an 80% negative outcome, which in medical terms is a disaster. We rarely do operations that have a 10% negative outcome." I said, "What do you mean a negative outcome?" I don't, he said, "We mean that the person is worse off after than before." And I just think that what's happening right now is that on an ideological basis, there's just a huge amount of harm being done. So yes, I've had this. Particularly it's bizarre how 10, 15 years ago, the vast majority of transgender were male to female. And tend to be older men, to be honest. And now the vast majority are teenage girls. And a lot of that is to do with social media, particularly YouTube influencers and all that kind of stuff. And again, there's plenty of research that shows that most, by the time they get to their mid-20s, revert to what's called their gender assigned at birth, which isn't assigned at birth. No doctor or nurse ever goes out and says, "We haven't got the quota of female, so this one will be a female." No one does that, So I do think, I don't want to minimize that there are serious issues for people who find a disconnect between how they feel and what their body is. But I think if, for example, and I've seen this happen so many times, you get a young girl and she feels that she's a boy or wants to be a boy and starts chest binding with all the harm that causes. And I don't understand. We're in a society which is, I would argue, it's a Gnostic society in the old Greek, well, it is a Greek word, where the separation between the body and the spirit, or how you feel or whatever, is becoming absolute, and it's doing so much harm. It really is. It becomes insane. But as I say, I'm trying to think of people. I've been involved with numerous people, quite a lot of people, who've suffered from gender dysphoria. And by the way, don't just say there's one group and one community. There isn't. There are a wide variety of expressions of gender dysphoria. But what I was going to say was, we are the only society that I know of since maybe the ancient Greeks, some of them anyway, who said, if there's a disconnect between body and mind, it's the body we need to change, not the mind. I think that's fundamentally flawed and harmful. So I would argue that the actual harm is caused by promoting. That 7-year-old girl, you're kidding me. Another girl, this girl absolutely amazed me. She wrote me, and I've told some of you this before, but it's still, I don't think I'll ever get an email that starts with in a more interesting way than this. She wrote me and she said, "Hi, David, I'm an ex-Mormon lesbian, and me and my girlfriends love you." I went, okay. What do I do with this one? And she told me her story. It was an incredible story. She'd been abused and raped as a child, very often, She decided when she was 13, she didn't want to be a woman. She hated women. So being a woman was a horrible thing. She transitioned at 14. At 16, she was about to go in for a major operation and literally sitting there thought, wait a minute, what's wrong with being a woman? There's nothing wrong with being a woman. So she got up and left. The amount of abuse and hatred she got for being ex-trans from some trans activists was unbelievable. If I did even a quarter of it, I'd go to jail. But they got away with it. Trans is the accepted ideology just now amongst a lot of our elites. And she said, I want you to tell my story. I said, why do you want me to tell it? She said, because I've had to move house, I've had to change, name and all that kind of stuff. And so I did tell her story. And the harm that was caused to her by, clearly the sexual abuse was a massive issue, but also the whole ideology and everything behind that. So your question is important. It's much more complex even than I have answered. But I don't buy into simplistic narratives. So someone says to me, because of your views, you are responsible for teenagers committing suicide. And I'm going, whoa, back off on the religious discrimination bill. I heard a senator in the parliament do something that I thought was horrific, use a family circumstance, and everyone said how brave he was, say about his nephew, and then say his parents weren't able to help him or save him. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, where is all this going? And basically where it was going was saying, if you pass this bill, you're responsible for teenagers committing suicide. And I thought, whoa, that is emotional manipulation that doesn't really fit. But sorry, that's a long answer to a very important question.
Long answer. Sorry, long answer, but a good one. And I agree with everything you say. We should probably have a whiskey one day to talk.
Yeah, I've 35 years ago, I had a transgender person in my congregation, and I've been dealing with that issue ever since. And I'm able to deal with it purely and simply because I regard every human being as made in the image of God. So, it doesn't, I don't get freaked out when, I had a guy who came, I went to a church and I was there for a wee while, and this guy came to the services and to the Bible studies dressed in a dress, and lipstick and everything. But the irony was he was totally anti-trans, but was just into cross-dressing. It made for some interesting Bible studies. But I just take people, I just look at everybody and say, well, you're made in the image of God. And yeah, you're screwed up, but then so is everybody screwed up in some way or other. So there's an equality there.
David, you mentioned that you imply that there are too many identities.
Yeah.
How many identities should there be for the good of humanity?
Well, it depends on who you want to call it. So, if people say, who am I? I would say, well, first of all, I'm a human being. That's the first thing. So that's the first identity we have. We are human beings. And what does that mean? That's where I would begin. Then for me, I would say my second identity, most important, is that I am in Christ, that I, belong to God, etc., etc. And then there may be things like, I'm quite proud of my Scottish identity. I must admit, sexuality comes quite well down the list for me. But, I can identify in that way. You can identify it in terms of taste. But what I find in society is we privilege certain identities. And actually, the big clash in society in the next 5 years is going to be the challenge of identities. So, does the fact that you're, gay trump the fact that you're Muslim or that someone else is Muslim or whatever? So we can take identity in lots of different ways. But I would say your fundamental identity, first of all, is what I was trying to say in the talk, is that you're a human being. And then you work things from there. I think it's actually very good. The trouble is with social media as well, we automatically get pushed into tribes. So, first of all, are you pro-mask, anti-mask? Are you both critical race theory, anti-critical race theory, and life just ain't that simple. Are you pro-Putin, anti-Putin? I do a podcast and I mentioned some questionable things about Ukraine as well. And people were saying, oh, you're a Putin apologist, you're of the devil. I'm going, no, I can't stand Putin, but why do we think in this binary way? So I would say my answer to that question would be, there's one basic identity that we're human beings, and from that comes a multiple of identities, and I wouldn't limit that. But I would just say get them in context. You know, being Scottish is not that great, really, but being Australian's worse. No. Yeah. Albert.
Hi, David. My following question might be a bit of struggling. You may choose to answer or not.
Well, knowing you, I probably won't, but go ahead.
Appreciate. As you said, humanity helped people to know God. Good people doing good and evil people doing evil. If this is true, how do we understand the Ukraine war and the leadership of Russia and the Ukraine? Are they evil or good? Are they bearing humanity expected by God, justice or evil? Okay. Where are they in the world?
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Now, Albert, that's actually a great question. And the only qualification I put on it was I was quoting someone saying human beings are good or evil. I don't agree with that. I think all human beings are created in the image of God. There is good within us. You know, I mean, Hitler was a vegetarian and liked dogs. You know, I mean, just because Hitler built motorways doesn't mean to say you know, if you like driving on a motorway that you're a Nazi. You know, so we've all got this mixture. We're all human beings, which means that there's good within us, but there's also evil within every one of us. And I'll go back again to Russians, to Solzhenitsyn. The dividing line between good and evil goes through the middle of every human heart. So as regards the war in Ukraine, please do not buy into a very simplistic ideology. There are two simplistic ideologies that people fall into. Ideas. One is, here's the good guys. You know, it's like people view it through, it's like Star Wars. You know, here's Darth Vader, Putin, and the forces of the empire, and you know, and then here's the bad guys, here's the good guys. It's the George Bush philosophy, which did so much harm in Iraq. There's an empire of evil, an empire of good. But don't fall into the trap of equivalence, saying Ukraine and Russia are just fundamentally the same. No, they're not. I've got friends in Kiev right now who they don't know if they're going to live. You know, they are just genuinely living with what is a rocket going to hit. I wouldn't make it morally equivalent at all. But recognize there is evil, you know, everywhere. I mean, people lie. I mean, I'll tell you this, Ukrainians are brilliant at propaganda. I got this ridiculous, you know, please don't get your news off TikTok. But if I got my news off TikTok, Ukraine are winning this war enormously. Whereas we have somebody connected with this, Gray Connolly, who, if you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, I would go onto his Twitter feed or read his media posts, because he's a brilliant analyst, and especially on the military side. But I would say, just as a Christian, I look at this and I go, yeah, I can try and understand why Putin's doing what he's doing, but I still think it's wrong and evil. But also, I don't buy into the fact that Ukraine is this wonderful paradise that's been taken over by this evil dictator. And I think if you have a biblical perspective, it helps you get a more balanced thing without falling into the moral equivalence.
Okay, one more question before we close. David, thanks very much for that. And just off the previous George's previous question, you know, obviously you've read many times the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going with this, and you've read Daniel. My gut feeling is, and I just wanted your opinion on this. There'll be a power in Europe that rises. There'll be powers in the East that join together. I'm not going to spend 10 minutes going through it all, because you know exactly where I'm coming with this. My feeling is that it could be, events could turn very ugly, and we could have possibly the return of Christ in this lifetime. Only God knows that. But I just wanted your thoughts on that. I mean, just very briefly, it's a huge topic. I didn't mean to throw it out there too badly at the end of this discussion, but just very briefly, what your thoughts are, because it would have crossed your mind.
Yeah, well, first of all, I need to apologize to you, George, for calling you Albert. I'm so bad with names. I don't even know my kids' names. Seriously, I really struggle with that. And also, I'm deliberately wasting time, so I don't have to answer that question. But no, look, it's a huge question. And the whole end time stuff and everything that's involved with that. The answer to the question is, I don't know. But I do know what Jesus said. There will be wars and rumors of wars in the Western world, where we haven't had plague for 100 years, and where, you know, we thought the First World War was the war to end all wars. The Second World War definitely was. And yet, you know, who of us, even a year ago, would have said there'd be a major land war in Europe? You know, that it's, and so I think, I mean, I wouldn't particularly, I'm not a big fan of taking parts of Daniel and Revelation and applying them directly to today in the sense of saying, I'm identifying this person or that country. I mean, I used to give talks on the late great planet Earth when I was a teenage Christian and knew everything. And I would give talks on how the world was going to end. Ironically, it was going to end with Russia invading, but not Ukraine. It was going to be Russia invading Israel and then the Chinese coming in and then nuclear war and everything. But look, human beings are screwed up. You just think about the state of politics and think about what's happening. And honestly, it would make you despair. I mean, maybe I should finish with this on a kind of note of hope. It doesn't sound hope, but right. So drought, war, plague, bushfires, whatever. And then I said to my son, look, forget all that stuff. He's really scared of spiders and sharks. So I said to him, forget all that. Listen, people don't get killed by sharks in Australia. Bang on the news. That very day, the guy got killed. I said, all right, forget the spiders. Bang on the news. There's going to be an increase of spiders because of the climate change or whatever. And okay, well, and then was it 2 days ago, I saw this cases of Japanese encephalitis through mosquito bites. And I'm going, oh my goodness, just where do I jump? And I do think there's a sense of despair, but for the Christian, it's this. We do know that God has the whole world in his hands. And in the midst of chaos and darkness and confusion and war and everything else, I think we've got a great gospel of hope to give. And part of that is saying to human beings, you really do matter. I think the biggest problem for many human beings today, particularly younger people, is they're being taught two contradictory things. One is that they themselves are the most important person in the world and they can be whatever they want. Utter rubbish. But the other more general thing is you don't really matter. And I think I would go to everybody and say, no, you really, really do matter. That's really important. And well, we'll come back to that at another time. I see a man standing here saying we have to go to work.
I'm very grateful for you not putting me to sleep with philosophy, or not really putting me to sleep with the opposite, my brain exploding because I couldn't quite keep up. But I think I did almost keep up with most of that. So thanks very much.
You should be a lawyer.
And thanks for coming back again next week, in 2 weeks' time, to continue this very engaging topic, one that's very, very much on our political and social agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're in the room, you have a feedback form. We would love to hear from you. We want to know what you thought about today. We'd love you to join a hope group. A hope group is a group of people that meet to look at what God's word says from one of the gospels. It meets on the alternate week. So it's no more than you get in the routine of every Thursday during school term and you're in, whether it's here as a larger group or as a smaller group, be able to ask a little bit more questions, a little bit more details of what the Bible talks to. So in 2 weeks' time, we're back here in the Law Society with David, continuing to examine the question of what is humanity. If you're online, you have the opportunity of using the online survey form, the QR code, and please submit that return. So thanks very much again for joining us today. And
can I just add something just before? Sorry, I forgot. In that regards, if anyone has questions or comments, or I often say things that people disagree with because, you're just not as righteous and intelligent as me, there's that for any Americans watching, that's what we call irony. But please feel free to contact me at theweeflee@gmail.com. That's one way to do it. The other thing is, if you know anybody who's in North Sydney at a lunchtime, on Tuesdays, I'm going to be doing a mini series inspired by this one, actually, looking at stumbling blocks to Christianity, but looking at human things. They're all the S's, so suffering, sex and sexuality, those kinds of things. It'll be 12:30 to 1:30 at St. Peter's Presbyterian Church, starting next Tuesday for the next 4 weeks. And you're very welcome to let anyone know. If any of you venture across into civilization across the bridge, you're welcome.
Who was the military strategist?
Craig Connolly. He's a lawyer here, well-known Catholic. He's appeared on the drum. Where's he going? Oh, hi, you. Oh, microphone, sorry. Yeah, Greg Connolly, who's a lawyer. He's quite often appeared on the drum. Fascinating guy, but he's one source that I would absolutely trust. I don't necessarily agree with, but that's not the issue. He provides balance in lots of things. So he's not really a military strategist, but he seems to know his stuff. And he takes on board other things, and a lot of people listen to him. So I've found him very helpful. And Peter, he's been here a few times, regular, yeah. So basically one of our own, and highly recommended.
Thanks again, David, and thank you again for joining us this morning. Thank you.